By 1859, British opinion was no longer supportive of their nation's presence on the Mosquito Coast. The British government returned to the Bay Islands and ceded the northern part of the Mosquito Coast to Honduras, negotiating with Guatemala to enlarge the British territory in Belize as compensation. The next year, Britain signed the Treaty of Managua, ceding the rest of the Mosquito Coast to Nicaragua. Slightly later on, in 1862, the settlement of Belize in the Bay of Honduras was declared a British colony and called British Honduras, and the Crown's representative was elevated to a lieutenant governor, subordinate to the government of Jamaica. Traveling back 1 year in time after Mexico had acquired a bunch of debt fighting the Americans and Mayans, at a time when America couldn't defend Mexico from its debtors due to fighting with itself over slavery. France invaded to forcefully take back what Mexico owed it, but eventually the American Civil War ended and they kicked the French out by 1867. It was also in 1867 that the people of Mexico realized they needed to industrialize to make sure something like that wouldn't happen again, and a man named Porfirio Diaz seized power in a coup and began industrializing Mexico. Later in 1883, the Mayan rebels established a state of Chan Santa Cruz in the caste war. During the 1880s, the Guatemalan president pushed the idea in Guatemala and neighboring El Salvador on Honduras to recreate a Central American Union like the long-dissolved Federal Republic of Central America. The pressure resulted in the nations of Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua signing a treaty in October of 1889, which proclaimed the Republic of Central America. Neither Guatemala nor Costa Rica signed the treaty, but they both did show interest in joining. In November of 1898, El Salvador declared that it would no longer be a member of the Union, since their leader believed that the interests of El Salvador would suffer. The Executive Council attempted to come to a compromise with El Salvador by offering it greater autonomy, but they refused. And when the military leaders of Honduras and Nicaragua failed to take military action against El Salvador, the Executive Federal Council declared dissolution of the Republic of Central America 16 days later. In 1893, the UK was enjoying good relations with Mexico's Porfirio Diaz administration, and British investment in Mexico had become of great economic importance, so the United Kingdom signed a treaty with Mexico recognizing the areas the Mayans were self-governing due to the caste wars as Mexican, formalizing the border between Mexico and British Honduras and closing their colony's border to trade with the Mayan rebels. And since Belizean merchants were Chan Santa Cruz's main source of gunpowder and guns, this was a serious blow for the independent Maya. In 1901, the Mexican army managed to occupy the independent Maya capital of Chan Santa Cruz. A Mexican telegraphed the news that the war was over on May 5th, 1901. While this date is most frequently given for the end of the war, fighting continued, although on a smaller scale, but with their capital lost. The Cruzab split into smaller groups, oftentimes hiding in small hamlets in the jungle. Their numbers were seriously reduced by deaths from epidemics of measles and smallpox, endemic diseases carried by Mexican troops. The Maya of Chan Santa Cruz remained actively hostile to the Mexican government well into the 20th century. And remember when I said that Diaz had been industrializing Mexico? He had been getting foreign companies to do that in exchange for getting monopolies in Mexico. The dynamics of this caused the wealthy and middle class to keep getting fatter and fatter while the poor kept getting thinner and thinner. This erupted in 1910 when the regime failed to find a controlled solution to the issue of presidential succession. That resulted in a power struggle among competing elites, which provided the opportunity for agrarian insurrection. The wealthy landowner Francisco I. Madero challenged Diaz in the 1910 presidential election, and following the rigged results, revolted in October 1910. Following this came a really complicated 4D chess versus Chinese checkers cross-console game war with a number of factions which deserves a video of its own. The combination of new economic factors such as political and social changes resulting from this Mexican Revolution eventually reduced the hatred and hostility between the Mayans and Hispanics in one form or another. Later in 1912, as a part of the Banana Wars, which would be a topic for another video, The United States occupied Nicaragua, provoking this man named Luis Mena to rebel unsuccessfully. Moving on, the caste war was officially over in September 1915. General Alvarado, sent by the revolutionary government in Mexico City to restore order in the Yucatan, implemented reforms which more or less eliminated the conflicts that had been the cause of the caste war. 4 years later, in March of 1919, Dr. Francisco Bertrand Barahona was at the end of his presidential term, who, in an attempt to place his brother-in-law in the presidency, political opponents rebelled against him. Eventually, in September of the same year, General Rafael Lopez Gutierrez emerged as presidential candidate of the Liberal Party of Honduras. In October, the elections are held and General Rafael Lopez Gutierrez is victorious. In 1920, the last faction in the Mexican Revolution, led by Pancho Villa, surrendered in 1920, leaving Alfredo Obregón as the last man standing, and his Laborist Party struck victories in the 1920 and 1924 elections. Back to Nicaragua. In 1927, another rebellion started in which a man named Augusto Cesar Sandino set his country free from the Americans. In 1929, various factions were brought together to form a revolutionary party in Mexico. 3 men in this party held the presidency in what would have been Obregón's second term. To alternation of the presidency by men who had previously held the office, the constitution was revised and reverted to the principle of no re-election, and the Revolutionary Party would go on to win every election for the next 80 or so years. In the 1930s, Mexico would be the first country to condemn Nazi Germany. Over the 1940s, the political scene in Costa Rica would gradually become more and more dominated by this guy named Rafael Angel Calderón, and the Costa Rican administration's use of military force in order to keep the peace. This caused a civil war in 1948, where the rebels supported by the USA took power after 44 days, brought in a new constitution which abolished the military. In 1951, Guatemala had finally ended the cycle of a string of military dictators seizing power from each other in violent coups, and their first democratically elected president had been put in power. But the USA didn't like him because he nationalized Guatemala's banana industry. So under the excuse of the threat of communism and the fear of the domino effect, funded a right-wing coup in 1953, but the American-backed president had been assassinated in 1957, starting a brutal civil war between various guerrilla forces in the Guatemalan government. By 1961, Britain was willing to let Belize become independent. Negotiations between Britain and Guatemala, who had disputed rights over all of Belize again in 1961, but the elected representatives of British Honduras had no voice in these talks. The most prominent Belizean statesman refused an invitation to make British Honduras an quote-unquote associated state of Guatemala, reiterating their goal of leading the colony to independence. In 1963, Guatemala broke off talks and ended diplomatic relations with Britain. Talks between Guatemala and British Honduras started and stopped abruptly during the late 1960s and early 1970s. From 1964, Britain controlled only British Honduran defense and foreign affairs. Internal security changed to Belize in anticipation of independence. Also in 1963, there was a military coup in Honduras to prevent the spread of communism. The military dictator Oswaldo was very corrupt, taking bribes from the USA, allowing it to buy Honduras's bananas tax-free, causing its economy to crumble. Oswaldo blamed the economic stagnation on illegal immigrants from El Salvador who had been moving there since both countries were agricultural, and Honduras had much more land per capita. The rounding up and deportation or expulsion of people to El Salvador caused a refugee crisis, and eventually tensions boiled into what we today call the Football War in 1969. After the threat of sanctions from other countries in the Americas and the guarantee of safety of El Salvadoran immigrants, El Salvador agrees to a ceasefire, but the refugee crisis that resulted from the war would later cause a civil war. By 1975, the Belizean and British governments, fed up of dealing with the military dictatorships of Guatemala, tried to attain self-determination in various international forums. Belize's government tried gaining international support to strengthen its position, weaken Guatemala's claims, and stop Britain from making concessions. Belize proved on the international stage that Guatemala was frustrated by Belize's legitimate aspirations to independence, and Guatemala was pushing an irrelevant claim and disguising its own colonial ambitions by trying to present the dispute as an effort to recover territory lost to a colonial power. Between 1975 and 1981, Belize had been arguing its case for self-determination at meetings between leaders of the non-alignment movement, Commonwealth countries, and at the UN. Latin America initially supported Guatemala between 1975 and 79. However, Belize won the support of Cuba, Mexico, Panama, and Nicaragua. And finally, in November 1980, Guatemala had become isolated and Belize was given its sweet, sweet independence. In 1979, El Salvador's leader, General Romero, had been ousted, probably because he had started the football war despite the fact that Oswaldo had provoked him. The years following Romero's downfall provided a kaleidoscopic array of events. The governing junta, made up of civilians and army officers, formed in 1979, collapsed 3 months later when its civilian members resigned because of their failure to reach agreement on reforms and their inability to bring the military under control. The head of the second junta enacted a package of laws that included an agrarian reform program. The reforms did not contribute to any reduction in the level of political violence, however. That was made clear in March 1980 when an archbishop who had become a vehement critic of the military establishment was assassinated while performing mass. In reaction to all these events, guerrilla units had joined to form the FMLN in opposition to the junta regime and announced the opening of an offensive at the beginning of 1981. The fortunes of the guerrilla army would ebb and flow throughout the balance of the decade. During that time, the guerrillas initiated and survived hard-fought battles with government troops who were trained and supplied by the United States. 7 years later, the arena candidate Alfredo Cristiani won the 1989 Salvadoran presidential election. Cristiani continued waging war on the guerrillas, but he was also willing to examine the FLMN's proposals for peace. After many civilians had been killed in crossfires, the president's commitment to reaching a negotiated settlement had increased greatly. UN-mediated peace negotiations began in 1990, and the two parties signed the Chapultepec Peace Accords in Mexico City on January 16, 1992. In 1996, another UN mediation granted peace between the Guatemalan government and the rebels, who had received land to farm in exchange for relinquishing their weapons. If you paid close attention, you would have noticed that Belize was the only country I focused on in this video to not experience a civil war in the 20th century. This made it a haven for refugees from its neighbors. It was also able to channel all of its income into its economy rather than a war, thus allowing it to become more prosperous than all of the other countries this video has focused on, except for Costa Rica and debatably Mexico, making it attractive for immigrants as well. Hence, a larger number of Hispanic mestizos live there than Anglophonic blacks and whites.